So we are in Unit 6, on water resources and water pollution. This is chapters 9 and 14. It also takes in the last part of chapter 4. So if you'll recall, when we did biomes, we did not specifically look at the water biomes because I wanted to move that over. So a lot of what we're talking about today is from the end of chapter 4. So that's mostly what we're talking about today. We're going to look at freshwater ecosystems and at saltwater ecosystems. So the Earth is covered in over 70% water, and the vast majority of that, over 97%, is salt water. And even when we look at the 3% that we have, a lot of it is not usable by humans. It's either trapped in ice, so our polar ice caps, or the glaciers, ice sheets, those kinds of things. Water is trapped there that we can't really access. The other thing that we can't access is water that's trapped in rock or underground or too deep in aquifers for us to get to. So let's think for just a minute about all the ways in which we use water. Water is not only just how we bathe, drink it, cook with it, wash our clothes. There's much, much deeper layers in which you use water that you're not even aware of. For example, we use water in manufacturing. So almost everything that is made has some process where they use water to wash the materials or to use the materials. Almost all of our electrical generation uses water. So the way it works is that you have water, and they heat it up until it creates steam, and steam turns a turbine, which then turns a generator and generates the electricity. We don't really have that many ways of getting around turning turbines. Even our hydroelectric power uses water to turn turbines. So we'll talk more about that later. But water is an extremely important component to what we do. And it's the manufacturing, the irrigation, so the food that you eat, it all comes back to water. Of course, water is a finite and closed system on the earth, meaning that what we have is what we have, and we reuse it over and over again, and it cycles back through. It cycles through, if you'll recall, through the watershed and through precipitation and evaporation and all of those things. So that sort of sets the stage for our water ecosystems. So the first one we're going to look at is freshwater. And there are, if you'll notice right here, there are the different ecological and economic services that we derive from our fresh water. So everything from climate moderation to scientific information to groundwater recharge all come through the freshwater system. And then from our economic standpoint, food, drinking water, irrigation, hydroelectricity, so all those things that we talked about. Think about our cities. Almost every single major city is either located on a coastline because water was available, or they're located along rivers. So the city of Dallas, as we talked about, the watershed of the Trinity River is where two major branches of the Trinity River come together. Freshwater has two different kinds of waters that are referred to. One is lentic water. Lentic water is standing water, so water that is not moving. Flowing waters are lotic water, and that's our streams and rivers. So flowing river depends upon where you find it as to what kind of ecosystem you're going to have. So zones make a difference, and when we so we'll talk about those. When we look at the services of rivers themselves, from an ecological standpoint, they deliver nutrients to the sea, which feeds then our estuaries and our coastal fisheries. The depositing of silt. Now this one, when we talk about our water diversion here in the next lecture, you're going to see that as we change and modify our rivers and divert them, we lose some of this benefit. And this is a big problem in the Mississippi River and the state of Louisiana is seeing that this lack of deposit or over deposit are making huge changes in the way that state looks. Rivers also purify water, and that's because they travel over rocks, and there's all kinds of things working on that help to purify it. Renews wetlands and provides habitats. All right, so once again, here is our watershed. Now, when we talked about the Trinity River, you'll notice that we don't follow the typical watershed. So when you look at this watershed, what you see is that the typical one that they show begins with precipitation in the form of snow and ice coming on the mountains and being trapped temporarily before it flows down and melts in the springtime, which forms the basis of many of the rivers around the world. Texas, we are spring fed for the most part, or rain fed, or even wastewater fed. So our rivers flow a little bit differently than normal. Now you'll notice in here there is in the midsection the floodplain. I'll talk a little bit more about floodplains as we go. All right, a headwater. This is up where the rivers begin. Typically, what you're going to see is that you have a lot of, you have narrow channels, you have cold water, and you also, especially in the mountains, have a change of elevation that's pretty drastic. And those things go to making the river very cold. So a narrow channel is going to make the water rush faster, as are the waterfalls. And what this does is that tumbling action means that the water is going to interact with the atmosphere more, which is going to increase the amount of oxygen present. The narrowing of channels, of course, is that water as it travels faster is going to be colder. So cold and oxygenated. And what this does is it changes the kind of wildlife and organisms that you're going to see in those waters. It's highly purifying. But fish that need a lot of oxygen because they have a lot of musculature, they're going to need that oxygen. Things like trout, salmon, anything that's swimming in those fast currents are going to have problems, or they're gonna need a lot of oxygen. As you move further downstream and the land flattens out, what you're going to find is that the ecosystems there, the water's is slower moving. That means you have less presence of oxygen because you don't have that tumbling motion, right? It also means the water's going to be warmer because you have more sunlight interaction. And what that means is that it's going to give more time for things like algae to form along. So these are going to get more productive from a food chain standpoint because you have a greater opportunity for algae to form and a food source. Cyanobacteria can be a bit of a problem because it can cause diseases. All right, our standing water is also known as our lotic water, lakes and ponds. So what is a lake? A lake, by definition, is a natural body of water. In the state of Texas, we do not have natural lakes. People usually point to Caddo, but Caddo is actually a wetlands, an inland wetland. So I'll talk about that here in a second. The lakes themselves, natural bodies of water, they're usually formed from precipitation and runoff and so forth. And we're going to go through each one of these different zones that are found along a natural lake. So the littoral zone, limnic zone, profundal zone, and benthic zone. There's one other that I'm going to mention out loud with my mouth, and that is the riparian zone. All right, so when we look at a lake, what we're going to see here is we have different zones that form that I was talking about. So along the edges are your littoral zone, and this is where you're going to find plants that have roots that tolerate a lot of water. And and then you'll have the riparian zone, which are the trees that form around it. So they require trees that require a lot of water. Limnic zone is where sunlight is going to reach, profundal, and the benthic zone. So this just gives you an idea of what it looks like in a typical lake or pond. All right, the littoral zone, once again, shallow, usually near the shores. High productivity, meaning you're going to have a lot of food. So the basis of the food chain, right? The plants that are there, also the photosynthesis that occurs. Also a lot of hiding places for different kinds of insects, macroinvertebrates, and other animals that kind of want to duck down. You might have, I don't know, snakes or whatever along those edges as well. And that's what they're hunting for. So highly, highly productive in those areas. And that's your littoral zone. Your limnic zone, this is the sunlight zone or the photosynthetic zone. The kinds of organisms you're going to see here, you're going to see a lot of photosynthetic algae. Plants that don't need roots are going to go along the edges up here. And you're also going to have schools of fish, small little fish that are going to feed on those organisms, those plant organisms, and then you're going to have fish that feed off of those. So a lot of your bass in lakes will travel along those limnetic zones where there's a lot of sunlight. There's also more oxygen up in that area. The profundal zone, because you have less photosynthesis, you're going to have less oxygen being present in those zones. The water's going to be very still and dark, right? So your organisms will shift and change there as well. So that's your profundal zone. And then the benthic zone, let's just go back for a second. So the benthic zone is along the bottom. And what you're going to find here along the benthic zone is a lot of decay. So everything falls down to the bottom, and you have a lot of decomposers in that benthic area. So it changes as well. Very, very little oxygen on the bottom of that benthic zone, which means that things that don't require oxygen, like catfish, are going to be down there. So slow movers. Okay, wetlands. So there are several different types. The first thing to say about wetlands is that they are extremely important. When we say drain the swamp, that's a bad thing because we need these. We need these very much. A lot of things go on in wetlands that actually are extremely valuable. The biggest one is that they act to absorb a lot of water from storms, and they hold it in, and then they serve to recharge a lot of the aquifers underground. So really, really valuable. In this picture, I want to point out something to you, and these are cypress trees. And you'll notice that there are little things that are sticking up out of the ground, right? Little stump-looking things. Those are actually roots. So what a bald cypress does is it grows in areas that are wet. It's not exactly tolerant of having it covered in water all the time. And the way it adapted was it formed these knees. That's what they're called. And they are actually the root coming up out of the water so that they're able to get the oxygen that they need. So we talked a little bit about roots and oxygen. And this was an adaptive feature of those bald cypress. What else do wetlands do? They filter out pollution. And this could be things like nitrogen and phosphorus and other things. So they're able to act sort of as a sponge to be able to put those to good use in a plant rather than let them flow them down and cause all kinds of problems later on. They help reduce flooding and erosion because they can absorb all of that overflow. They replenish streams during dry periods and help recharge aquifers. And they're also highly productive for recreation. So the Caddo Lake is essentially a swamp. All right, we'll get to that in a second. So a marsh. So these are different kinds of wetlands. The first one is a marsh. A marsh is defined as something that is temporarily flooded, and these are usually floodplains. And they can be highly productive because they are taking in all that silt that came through erosion and settling it out. In those areas, they can be good for farming, and they just serve as a really good place for things to grow, mostly grasses and so forth. And they can absorb a lot of water. Now, in the state of Texas, we've had to learn the hard way that these need to be protected. So, Houston is near the coast, obviously, and they have had high numbers of a lot of growth in Houston. It's exponential growth, and it's also had a lot of sprawl. There are rules about building houses in floodplains, and the reason they set these at like 1 in 100. So you'll hear about 100-year floodplain, which means that that area will flood once every 100 years, and that's just a number that they sort of came up with. So a lot of people are like, well, insurance companies they'll raise your rates up really high if you build in a floodplain, or they'll make you get flood insurance. Well, what people have done is they're just like, that's okay. I won't worry about that flood insurance because it's only once in 100 years until you have a hurricane like Harvey, which turned around on the city of Houston 3 times, right? And people had built in these floodplains. And what this did was it also caused the city of Houston to not have anywhere for that extra water, millions and millions of gallons of water, billions of gallons of water. It had no place for it to go because ordinarily it would go into these floodplains. Instead, the floodplain is now covered in concrete and houses, and that water just has to rise and stand. So this can be really, really difficult if we don't respect the role that marshes can play in our ecosystems. City of Dallas, as I talked about in that watershed note, has also had its experience in Fort Worth, both with the flooding that has come in these temporary marshes. A swamp is permanently covered in water. So Caddo Lake is a wetlands. It's a swamp, always covered in water. Now they dredge it out so that you can get boats in through there. But for the most part, the plants that are growing there are highly adapted to being permanently covered in water. And there's lots and lots of things going on in swamps that are extremely valuable as wetlands. And so while it is called a lake, it is actually an inland swamp. Hardwood bottomland forest. So in that riparian zone along your streams and rivers, you're going to have trees that don't mind getting a lot of water. So oaks and pecans grow in those hardwood forests and elms. So if you think about streams in Flower Mound, and some of you are going to go out and look at those, the streams in Flower Mound have those riparian zones, and those are hardwood bottomland forests. So you're going to see a lot of the trees that I mentioned here, your oaks, your pecans, your elms, willows, that they don't mind being wet every now and then. They don't tolerate all the time, but they're along those areas. Lots of water to grow. They're along the Trinity River, between Lake Ray Roberts and Louisville Lake. You'll see an area that looks very much like this. There's a green belt, and it also is a hiking trail along there. I highly recommend going out there. It looks just like that picture. A prairie pothole. So these are in places where you're going to have maybe snow, and the snow is going to sit on the ground and it's going to melt, and it's going to stay in an area for a limited amount of time. So Canada, for example, would be a place where that would happen. And then migratory birds then can take advantage of those as kind of resting spots along the way. A peat bog. So this is it's going to fill in over time, and it actually fills in with plants. So you're going to have peat moss that's going to grow, and then it's going to get cold and freeze. And so a lot of these are found in northern climates. When I went to Iceland, we saw a lot of peat being grown. So what happens is you'll have a layer that will grow. It's sort of like the tundra, right? And then another layer will come on above it. Now it gets wet and holds a lot of water, but over time those layers form and form and form, and eventually the water really can't absorb any further into those peat bogs than just on the surface. And eventually that peat will become coal. So it's just going to take a lot of time for that to happen. And then they can turn around, because it stays dry, they can actually cut that peat out and take and burn it. All right, John Bunker Sand. So this is a really interesting story. John Bunker Sands Wetlands is a place in North Texas where they actually do natural green wastewater treatment. And what they were able to do was take water that well, first of all, there was an issue with zebra mussels. So the spread of zebra mussels is very disconcerting. And the state of Texas tries to stop it. So they were going to cut off the flow of water from the Trinity through Lake Lavon and on down to the south because of the presence of zebra mussels. Well, that meant that the city of Dallas was going to lose about 25% of their drinking water and their water that we use for all kinds of household uses. So they were like, how do we recover that water? Well, wastewater generally is sent downstream, right? We dump it out, we clean it up, dump it out, and it goes downstream. Eventually it ends up in Houston. Another day, another story. But what they did was they established these wetlands over in this eastern part of Dallas called and John Bunker Sands was a man who owned the land. And what they do is they take the wastewater from Dallas and they pass it through this wetlands where it removes pollutants and impurities. And then they pump it back up to Lake Lavon where it is now being used. So the city of Dallas was actually able to take a natural setting, create a wetlands, and then be able to recover their water themselves. So that's a recycling process that happens pretty quickly. That wetlands is a really fascinating place. And what it also becomes a good habitat for a lot of birds, migratory birds. There's a family of bald eagles that live out there and some other really interesting things. I'm a big fan. All right, an estuary. So an estuary is more along the coastline. And estuaries are a place where saltwater and freshwater meet. So they're gonna come together, and so you're gonna find organisms that can tolerate more salty water be able to move into this area, and then some that can tolerate a little bit of salt, but not completely fresh. So it's a mixing that happens. Anytime you have two biomes that come together like that, you are going to have a lot of productivity. The reason is you have all of the organisms from one zone and all from another ecosystem, and so you have the best of both worlds. So anytime there's that crossover, it's going to have a lot of high productivity. A salt marsh. So this is along coastlines, and the ground is saturated with water, but it's not completely covered with water all of the time. Slow decay, and lots of productivity here as well. So animals will come in and use this area to raise their babies from the ocean. So really cool places. Now here's the problem. Humans decided that we needed beaches and we needed to build along coastlines. So a lot of places took and removed all their salt marshes. They built up barriers to keep water from coming in. They dried it out and they tried to build stuff on top of it. We have learned that this is a really bad thing to do because we're taking away the natural ability to stop storms from being really severe. So there's a lot of restoration that's happening in coastal wetlands because we're seeing just how valuable that those are. So they can help mitigate storms. They can help with taking care of absorbing a lot of energy, and they can actually work to keeping us safe rather than us needing it to put another high rise up. A mangrove. This is a picture of me and my husband going through a mangrove forest in the Keys. So mangroves are really cool because they're trees. They grow in salt water, but they are not saltwater tolerant. So what they do is their roots are actually above the water. All right, so they can be in there, but their root system are like a little above it, and which works as a really great place for organisms to go in there and kind of hide and use them as hunting grounds and all kinds of other things like that. The cool thing, another story about mangroves, is that their leaves grow on this imagine that this is like a stem and it's got 5 leaves above it right here. Because it's not salt tolerant, what it does is one of these leaves becomes like a sacrificial leaf. So it will absorb all of the salt water and the rest of them can continue to grow. So once again, we learn that tearing down mangrove forests has cost us a lot. It's ruined a lot of environments and made us much more susceptible to storms. So estuaries are very important. Wastewater treatment, recreation, food, all kinds of things. So this kind of gives you a comparison when we look at those different areas along coastlines that are considered to be estuaries, and just how valuable they can actually be for us. Saltwater ecosystems. So there's several different kinds. The intertidal zone, this is a place where you're going to see the sea rise along coastlines. So you have high tides and low tides, and the environment can change drastically between those two. So crashing waves, mud flats, so lots and lots of variation in how that happens. So organisms that can hang on and cling to rock are ones you're going to find in these intertidal zones. So like the sea stars, barnacles, anything that can cling and hang on is going to do very well in an intertidal zone. Coral reefs. So coral are animals. Y'all probably all know that by now. They have an exoskeleton. And what they do is they have a mutualistic relationship with algae. And the algae feed the coral, and the coral provide a home for the algae. So it's a really cool relationship. And what the algae does is it provides some of the coloring that coral have. So what has happened is as the ocean has become absorbing more and more CO2, the ocean itself is becoming more acidic. And the algae that live in the coral have a very narrow tolerance for pH change. So they're dying. And as they die, it leaves the coral without their color. So when we talk about coral bleaching, that's what's going on. The algae has died and it's leaving the coral sort of in a lurch. So this symbiotic relationship, once it's lost, then becomes problematic, really problematic. So coral, once again, are huge barriers for storms, so they can absorb lots and lots of storm damage. They're also areas that are highly productive. lots and lots of fish and plants and so forth in those areas. When you look at a healthy coral reef, that's what one would look like. You're going to see lots of color, lots of growing fish, anemone, all kinds of good things. And humans depend greatly on these coral reefs to provide food for us. And as those are dying, we are losing a tremendous amount of our food sources. So when we look at the ocean, it has its own set of zones as well. So you have your photic zone at the top, photic meaning light. So you're going to find your photosynthetic organisms in that top layer. And then below it is the aphotic zone, and it's a gradual change, what they call twilight to no light. So less and less photosynthesis going on. Organisms change in adapting to that. It also has a benthic zone, which is the area that runs along the bottom. And that changes as the water gets deeper and deeper as well. So you have your intertidal zone, and then your continental shelf, and then the bottom. And here's just a brief explanation about that. So remember, in freshwater, you have limnetic and profundal and benthic, right? And then you have your littoral zone around the edge. In the open ocean, it's referred to as the photic, the aphotic, and the benthic. Let's see. You'll see that as the light changes, also temperature can change as well. So depending on where it is, you're gonna end up with different kinds of organisms depending on what their needs are. Okay, that's all for today. I'm gonna skip this and just if you want to know a little bit more about thermal stratification, you can. All right, thank you so much, and I will see you next time.